Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. And welcome to today's webinar titled Stay Ahead of the Game. Learn how to conduct an evidence-based GVD faster and smarter to improve market access, featuring 5 experts who will address systematic literature review issues that can negatively affect your global value dossiers and how automation can improve your product's market access. I wanted to take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's event, Distiller SR, for making it all possible. And joining us today, we're fortunate to have 5 panelists participating in this session. I'll first introduce Sue O'Leary. She heads up the Evidence and Access team at Prime Global, supporting pharma clients across the life cycle to make sure that evidence is optimal not just for launch, but beyond. Next up, we have Jillian Sibring, who has dedicated the last 20 years of her HEOR and market access consultancy career to refining and streamlining the process of SLR and GVD development. Our third speaker is Ben Rousseau, who is Senior Director at Adelphi Values Prove, where he heads up the technology and commercialization team and has nearly 30 years of experience across multiple agencies and consultancies. The fourth speaker with us is Rachel Forrest, a key account manager at Distiller SR who prioritizes customer satisfaction through her almost 25-year background in dental practice leadership and project management, executive level administration, software sales, and customer experience management. The final participant with us today is also today's moderator, Dr. Patty Peoples, the president and founder of the Peoples Collaborative. Patty is a health economist, pharmacist, and industry leader with 35 years of experience in healthcare value, evidence, and access. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome Patty to join me. Hi, Patty. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, Sydney. Thanks so much. And welcome, everyone. I am really glad that you've chosen to spend the next hour with us today. I'm particularly excited about today's panel. They have years and years of experience really in the trenches and are going to bring some really pragmatic insights and some forward thinking to today's discussion. So thanks for being here. Let me set the stage for today's webinar. Health technology assessment agencies and payers, as we all know, are demanding increasingly detailed evidence for the conclusions that manufacturers are making about the value of their new products. These payers are requiring comprehensive justification for the assumptions, comparators, and criteria that are used to assess the potential value of a new product. Now, we consolidate all of this evidence into a global value dossier that's used to inform the HTA agencies and the payers. Systematic literature review are one of the key sources of information for global value dossiers. Now, each of you have your own approaches to putting together these global value dossiers. But one thing that you all share in common, I suspect, is that these reviews generate an enormous amount of data that has to be vetted, captured, categorized, analyzed, and updated regularly. This process is time-consuming, it's labor-intensive, and expensive, increasingly so with all the new information out there. So today's webinar is really going to dive into this challenge, and our esteemed panel is going to give some ideas of how they utilize automation in systematic literature reviews to improve the accuracy and the efficiency while supporting a targeted and fit-for-purpose dossier that can be used to maximize market access. Thanks for joining us today. Let's kick it off with a bit of an overview of automating systematic literature reviews. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Patty. Hi, I'm Rachel Forrest, a key account manager at Distiller SR. I'm lucky enough, I work with many of our pharma teams as well as CROs. And this topic is top of mind for many of them and likely all of you. So I'm really excited for this conversation today. We know that preparing a GVD can involve reviewing hundreds or thousands of references, screening, analyze, extracting relevant data, and categorizing each document to create a powerful value story. And the evidence from every stage of a product, from product discovery through to post-market, is required for a robust document. The quality of the literature review is integral part of the document, and for many teams, literature reviews are still a fairly manual process. The central tension in preparing a GVD is between inclusivity and relevance. With the number of bibliographic databases increasing and the volume of products and literature multiplying at an exponential rate, how do we better manage the information coming at us? In an increasingly complex healthcare and payer environment, leveraging automation to support the expansive and labor-intensive functions of literature reviews can improve accuracy, consistency, transparency, and efficiency, and be part of not only your GVD, but your HTAs and other systematic or targeted reviews as well. Evidence management is a critical component of product development, encompassing the systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation of data to support decision-making at every stage of the product development lifecycle. When there's a gap in research quality or evidence management, the risks can range from lower product development to delayed commercialization. Collaboration, a well-defined, repeatable process, and automation can accelerate your literature reviews and the product development timeline substantially. At the end of the day, we are all on the receiving end of your hard work and want the same thing, better research. Patty, back over to you.
Thanks so much for that. I'd like to now invite all of our speakers to come online, and we will jump into our panel discussion. Hello, Sue, Ben, Jillian. Glad to have you here. Rachel, thank you. All right, let's get started with kind of a 20,000-foot view, shall we? Panel, this is going to be to all of you, but Sue, I'm going to direct this for you to jump in first. What are the main challenges that you face with developing a very high-quality value dossier that is maximizing its impact? It is fit for purpose, but it's also efficient based on the client goals.
Yeah, thanks, Patty. Great question, and aligns well with some of the things that came out in the poll. So the biggest challenge that I find is around the deadlines now, about getting something done globally, but that is actually in the right state to give to the affiliates and start sharing early. So really what is key is tight deadlines. And I think as more of the regulatory approvals are going to be done sort of more in parallel with some of the HTA submissions, it's really important to get that done. And we hear that often when we talk with the global teams about the requirement to get things done efficiently, quickly, and out to the markets. And so some of the ways that we're starting to address that is really looking at giving parts of it out in a modular way, so that you don't sort of wait for everything to be finished, reviewed, uploaded, that you can have sections like the burden of the disease done out to countries so they can start actually preparing and getting aligned with the work. So I think that really is key. Get it right. Don't wait for your health economics model to be nailed in the last section. Because by that time, actually, there's quite a lot of time that has gone on. So I think that's key. We hear it a lot, and interested to hear people's views.
Mm-hmm. Jillian, give us some insight into how you grapple with trying to get it done right.
Well, I think what we often try to do with the literature review aspect of developing GVDs is to use the most appropriate methodology for the therapy area that you're working in, and for reviewing the evidence that's underpinning your particular value proposition. So the methodology that we use really depends on the volume of literature available, the type of evidence we're trying to identify, the place of the product in the market, and what's available already from other sources, like a scientific communications platform, for example, or previous SLRs that have been done, or reviews from other sources. So the methodology we'd use, for example, to treat a rare disease for a product that's first in class might be different to the methodology that we would use for a more established product in a crowded market.
And methodology, you mean targeted versus systematic? Could you tell us a little more what you mean by that?
Yes. So we quite often use targeted reviews to identify the evidence or understand the burden of illness, the treatment landscape, the unmet needs, and perhaps to define populations or relevant comparators. Whereas if we're looking more into the appropriate efficacy outcomes to shape clinical trials or demonstrate comparative clinical or cost effectiveness, then we might use a fully systematic approach. So, sometimes it's appropriate to do a systematic search to identify all of the available evidence, but then to use a more pragmatic way to review the evidence. And that can save time and money. It can be more efficient to do it that way, particularly for some types of evidence. So, for example, what we often do is maybe use a team of reviewers where they just look at each piece of evidence once and, share the workload between them. Whereas if we were doing a review of clinical or economic data, then we might use, a Cochrane methodology with two reviewers working independently.
So let's dive just a little bit more into this, Jillian, and then we're going to go to Ben. So global value dossiers typically have a lot of different sections that collate the evidence that supports different parts of the value story. Now, how do you go about identifying evidence in a systematic way when many times there are multiple research questions that the client is coming to you, and they may need all of these questions answered, but they need to be addressed either in a sequential or a more thoughtful way? How do you grapple with that?
Yeah, so one option that we've used in the past is to do a broad search using a systematic search string, but then to use a slightly more pragmatic methodology, as I've said, to bucket articles at the abstract review stage. One example of this that springs to mind is we were asked to do a review of a rare disease and categorize the evidence. So, have you lost me?
No, what did you say, Sue?
Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
So good. So we categorized the evidence. They wanted to look at the classification of the disease, the burden of illness, the clinical data, the treatment landscape. And before we had access to Distiller SR, the one way we used to do is to use the drop-down menu function in Excel to tag articles and then prioritize those for full text review using more refined criteria, so that you would then establish, okay, what are the criteria that we need for these articles as opposed to these articles? And then that allows you to prioritize certain articles for data extraction as well. For example, if they're needed earlier in the GVD development process, as Sue was talking about earlier. But one of the issues that we had with using Excel was the overlap between the categories, and it's quite this can be done in Excel, but it can be clunky. Whereas what I think we would use the label function in Distiller SR, which we've been using a bit more recently, because that allows you to give multiple labels to the same article, and then you can retrieve different sets of articles using filters. And that, export that to whatever package that you would then use for the output that you require. So yeah, that's one example of how we use bucketing, but obviously there are other methods as well, and I think Ben's going to go into that a bit more too.
Thank you. And I'd like to bring the audience in here. If you could just drop into your chat, into the Q&A, rather, not the chat, the Q&A, and let me know how you are using Excel or some other platform to help you prioritize articles. Jillian has given a couple of approaches that they use, but I'd be interested to hear what your approach is. Ben, let's bring you into the discussion. I know that in our conversations ahead of this webinar, you spoke at length about how many conversations you have with your clients as you try to better understand what their intent is, what their goals are with that GVD or with the SLR. What discussions do you typically have with clients as we talk about all of the vast source materials that could be utilized in this?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the clients that we work with have different ways and different processes that they have internally that they have to follow for global value dossiers. And so I think understanding that and understanding what they need to do as a business. So some of them will have to have a requirements for full SLR, comprehensive SLRs for generating the evidence for the GVD, but some take a more pragmatic approach in terms of making the most of what they have already from other work streams. So really it's about, I suppose, having those conversations to explore what is going to be available. And I think that's where we often have that discussion and question to us from the client saying, what do you need from us? And so, that's where we draw upon our experience across multiple different companies and areas to sort of make recommendations and proposals for what they might have to look within their organization. So, it's not just within market access, but across multiple different functions. So HEOR, obviously, they do a lot of work for their evidence generation, and that's often an important source of information. And medical with their scientific platform. I think, Gillian, you already mentioned that previously as well. So really it's a case of having that upfront discussion to make sure that we're using our experience and expertise to make a recommendation for what the most appropriate methodology will be. Because based on that, we'll be able to make our recommendations for how we can focus any specific literature review that is going to be required to make it in the most efficient way possible, and from a resource and timing and budget perspective as well.
Thank you, Ben. Let's move on to the meat of the webinar and talk a little bit about the role of automation. Is there a place for artificial intelligence in systematic literature reviews to support GVD development? Jillian?
Yes, I think there is, certainly in some situations. So, for example, rapidly evolving therapy areas like we've seen with COVID, large volume of literature where you have to stay abreast of that. And I think there's certainly a function for AI tools in terms of prioritizing information for further review by humans, or looking for the same thing lots of times. I can definitely see a need there, but a blended approach can sometimes be more optimal when you're making sure that the quality is there. So, for example, you might have an AI reviewer and a human reviewer working together, checking for errors between them that might not be picked up as easily by a human. But there are some cases, I think, where human interpretation is essential. We had an example recently where we were looking for the humanistic burden of a disease, which quite often the outcomes are secondary and not reported in the abstract, which makes it difficult when you're devising your screening criteria. Do you put everything through into the full text review that looks potentially relevant, which might take a lot of time if you've got hundreds of articles to go through? So in that case, we had to come up with a sort of semi-systematic way of exercising more caution for certain types of records to make sure that we weren't missing anything that might be relevant. And I think that would have been difficult to program for AI, but I think there are certainly situations when it can augment what humans are doing.
So you've given an example where an outcome may not be in an abstract, but is in the full text. So you're using automation. Ben, I know that you also have a case study for automation, because it's global value dossiers are oftentimes ever evolving. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think from the perspective of, and it sort of follows on from what Sue said earlier about the process, and often we can have what we call the sort of foundation GVD. So we're building the initial evidence at an earlier stage, and there will be searches that are conducted from that perspective. But you know, then once we have those done, then we can have the updating process and running some of those through Distiller for to make a much more efficient search and processing of evidence at a time in the process in the overall process where things started to get a bit pinched as you get closer to launch, and you know that stage of the market access process, then you know, time becomes increasingly a challenge. So anything that we can have that is going to be help sort of streamline that process will adds to that, and sort of on the back of what Gillian was saying there as well. So using some of the functionality that allows us to filter large sets of data and run those based on the experience of the human screening, and then let the AI sort of learn from that and take over, really helps to sort of focus where we spend our time as human reviewers, and yet still have the confidence that we're capturing a lot of what's going to be useful for the GVD. And then apart from that, there's all the sort of the added sort of technology benefits, I suppose, of being able to filter and label content so that it may not be relevant initially, but it's something that, you know, once it's in the system, we can then search on that and go back to it at a later date. And often that's something that clients quite like, in terms of that we've got an evidence base that's been processed, but it may not all be used at once. So and that's something that can support future updates, etc. as well.
That seems like a real efficiency gain there. What I'd like to do now is to go to an audience question, and I want to thank you for submitting those already. Antonio has a question. How do you, and I think that, Gillian, this is more than likely a question you can weigh in on. How do you justify skipping data extraction of studies you don't find relevant to your review if you search systematically and then you end up with a huge evidence number for data extraction? How do you justify skipping data extraction of studies?
I guess I'm not quite sure where this question's coming from, but I guess we don't skip data extraction. We wouldn't skip data extraction of a relevant study necessarily. I think there's probably two different questions here.
You don't find relevant. How do you justify skipping it for those that you don't find relevant? Maybe there's a process.
Okay, so I guess it comes down to the systematic review process, that there are multiple stages, so you shouldn't end up skipping data extraction for relevant studies. So first of all, you look at the abstracts, and the process you go through. We use a method called positive exclusion. So we only exclude studies that definitely don't meet any of our criteria. So if it's unclear, they would generally go through to the full text review stage, when you have more information to be able to see if the paper is relevant or not. And then at that stage, you know, again, you can see, okay, is this going to be eligible for data extraction? Is there something that's relevant in there? And I think it depends as well on the type of evidence that you're looking for. So obviously, if it's clinical or economic evidence, generally we would go to the point of data extraction for everything that is potentially relevant, unless we find that there are data that are not extractable in there for some reason, like they're in a graph or there isn't the relevant information there. If it's more background information on the burden of illness or the treatment landscape, then we have to think more about, okay, how much of this information do we have? You know, sometimes you have enough information, you don't need to include absolutely everything. So it might be that you go for the most recent studies, the biggest studies, the most robust studies, and there'll generally be criteria that we use and we agree with whoever has asked us to do the review or whoever has commissioned the GVD. I don't know, does that answer the question?
I think that sums it up. Thank you very much.
I'll just add to that as well, Patty. I think what we talked about earlier on about some of the labeling side of it as well, I think is really useful for that, because it allows us to, as long as we agree up front in terms of what those criteria are, in terms of what we feel is going to be the level of relevance for the GVD, because there's no way it can be a complete repository of all evidence. That's just not feasible for a lot of areas. So often we would put in some thresholds for inclusion, and the labels really help with that, because there are maybe ones that are still that they maybe don't meet those thresholds, but we still want to keep a record of them as well, so for future updates. So that's certainly something that we use in those cases as well.
Yeah.
Rachel, have they touched on the tools that are available within Distiller SR?
Are you sure you want to get me started talking about Distiller SR? I could spend an hour just speaking about features that will expedite this process. But we are going to be doing a demonstration next week, which I will be hosting. And so again, feel free to register for that, because I don't want to take up a lot of time. But as far as, and again, this might be relevant when we talk about updating or living reviews. There are some key features within Distiller SR that our customers are leveraging in order to be able to better manage updating a previous. Again, GVDs are living documents, and sometimes it's relevant to update a previous review. And I'm not sure, would you like me to speak to some of those features now, or?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead and touch on them.
Yeah, that's great. So there's a few, and actually there's a few ways that our customers may do this in Distiller SR. One way is being able to, again, once we have a defined process, we build a workflow or a template, a master template. It makes it very, very fast and easy to clone or copy that workflow or that template, so that if you want to update a previous project or review, you can simply go click a button, clone your project. You have the option of bringing over all of your curated references or not. Again, if this is an update, you may want to start clean with just the workflow. The way that I prefer to manage living reviews, and many of our customers do this, is when you're initially working on a project, we can set up something called Lit Connect. Lit Connect will allow you to bring in email auto alerts from various data providers. So if you're setting those email auto alerts, they can be sent directly to your project in Distiller SR, so that you don't have to think of, they happen automatically, and you'll get a notification from Distiller saying you have new references to screen. Very helpful. And we can also layer more automations on top of that. So again, if you're updating a previous review that you've already worked on, you're already going to have references that have data associated with them. How do we differentiate between the new literature and the old literature? Labels. Our panelists keep bringing up labels, and I think it's relevant because we can auto apply labels onto those new references coming into the platform. For example, you may want update 2023 or March 2023 as a label, so that you can then filter, organize, and report on that information later, very, very simply. Deduplication's another feature that people love. Again, if sometimes you're looking at thousands of articles, having AI and natural language processing go through and really, really quickly quarantine any duplicates so that you're not duplicating your work is great. My favorite feature, I would say, and I know a lot of our teams would agree with me, is AI reprioritization. It is a risk-free way to utilize AI. We call it re-rank, and basically, especially when you have a living or an update review, this is great because as your reviewers are going through the title and abstract and determining based on your criteria what is relevant, what is not relevant, and including and excluding literature, the AI is very quickly learning in the background what the humans include and exclude. And so your reviewer may be going exclude, 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 include, exclude. And then what happens is the AI will start to bubble up the most relevant articles. So it will be include, 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 and then all of your excludes will be sitting pooled at the bottom. Because you may get 500 hits on a literature search, maybe you'll have a handful that are actually relevant to the topic or to your project. And so this is a really great way to save a ton of time. And again, we can talk about a few other really key features would be Curator CR, which is it's a module that works with Distiller, and it's basically an evidence management hub. And so it allows you to continuously curate, share, update, and reuse previously screened references, and that includes PDFs, which means if you can share data and information across reviewers, across projects, across your team, and even more largely across teams, so across your organization. And then for our partners who, maybe it's a manufacturer working with a CRO and you want to be able to share PDFs that have already been purchased or be able to reuse data that's already been screened. Again, it's just a really great way to collaborate and manage the evidence. And then Datorama, the last thing I'll speak to. Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. Let's move on, because I think that you have likely given some interesting aspects of the platform that people can learn a deeper way by participating in the demo next week. So thank you for that. Right, let's now talk about something that has just been an increasing challenge that every one of you are out there grappling with, and that is the volume and diversity of literature and the evidence needed for the global value dossiers. It's just an exponential volume of literature, and then types of literature that are coming from so many different sources. How do you mitigate, Ben, this particular challenge with, and is the automation or AI useful to you as you're dealing with increasing volume and diversity of literature?
Yeah, I think it touches on quite a few things that we've already covered as well. So bringing that together, I mean, it does vary immensely depending on the area that we're looking at, and then there may be some smaller disease areas where there is a very manageable volume of evidence, and it can be handled by traditional methods, and we don't need to be looking at any other sort of enhancements, I suppose, to refine that. But when you're looking at some of the bigger areas, you can have tens of thousands of abstracts in a search. Then it becomes a bit of a bigger proposition. So I think the thing that we would always sort of encourage is spending that time up front, discussing with the client to make sure that we've got the most appropriate protocol in place. So we know and agree exactly what we're looking for and how are we going to filter those results to make sure that we're getting what's relevant for the particular objective as well. So and I think as we've started to use Distiller within this process, then it's also been how do we describe that within the protocol as well. So and it comes back to what we were saying before in terms of putting in those thresholds for and it may be, say, on study size, for instance, in terms of we only want to be looking at the major studies over a certain sort of a number that's going to be included. So it allows us to filter on that. The single biggest one, I would certainly agree with Rachel as well, is the re-ranking, because if we can set an agreement in terms of a threshold, so at what point do we call a line on on the screening process for abstracts. So is it when we have had, say, we've gone 200 abstracts without getting any inclusions because it's been re-ranking them? As long as we agree that threshold, then that's something that we can do sort of moving forward as well. So alongside that, I mean, we started to be looking at setting up specific AI classifiers which are going to be targeted to specific search areas. So not specific to any disease specifically, but some of the more common ones that come up as part of the searches for GVDs. So we can start looking at how we can use the AI to screen on our behalf, and then or maybe do an initial screen and then supplement that with the human touch beyond that as well. Thank
you, Ben. Great summary. Sue, let's bring you into the conversation. I know that you work at the level where you're coordinating all evidence generation for your clients. And what do you recommend as the optimal time to initiate that GVD process?
I kind of think it can never be too early, Patty. I mean, I think one of the things that's really key is that quite early on the value proposition is defined. And to do that, you really need to start that sort of process of the Global Value Dossier and really understand your sort of core sections of what you're trying to drive in your sort of product and how it's going to evolve and be differentiated. So early, and particularly to understand that sort of burden of disease and really work out, I think as Gillian and Ben have both alluded to, it's, you know, what is the reason why you might be doing a systematic review and what are you going to be populating with that? So early is best. Get countries aligned with some of the evidence that is being generated, you know, and work through that. And it really depends how big. Is this the first asset? Is this a life cycle extension? There's so many sort of questions. So we just sort of say you have to have that upfront discussion and really talk to clients about expectations, because I think that's probably the most important thing, is to align on what's required for when, and share that.
Thanks for putting that into perspective. Audience, when did you typically begin this GVD process? I'd love to hear from you. We have a question from Katerina, and I'm not sure which of you will be able to answer this. How do you anticipate UNETA joint assessment will impact evidence generation? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll have a go.
Okay.
I'll start, because we did do some reviews when some of the pilot UNETA assessments were going on. I think timing is going to be a key thing, because whilst we're going to sort of drive that sort of consolidated ambition, we're still not quite sure how the country processes might require updates to certain sections. So I think that there's some of this being able to capture data so that you can maybe align to a UNETA timeline. But then if there are some country outliers, which we usually have, that will want to do their own reviews to be able to go back and refer to that. So I think it remains to be seen how much UNETA will mean that some of the country standard of care updates aren't going to be required. I think we've been waiting a while to see how that actually translates to practice. I don't know, Ben, Gillian, if you've got anything to add. We're aspirational in that, in how that UNETA might impact efficiency.
I think it's a bit of an unknown at the moment, but I think what will be important is the best practice that we have from in current fields, making sure that gets applied to the process as well, because I think we've got to make sure that that's shared amongst others. So if there is good practice that is being developed sort of by outside of that joint assessment process, then making sure that it's reflected, and once it will happen over time, I think. So I think people will start to use it, and it will get shared that way.
Thanks. So let's stick with you and look at how broad application for those SLRs and GVDs and how they can be intersected with HTA submission. Can systematic literature reviews that are developed for the Global Value Dossier, can they also be used for HTA submissions around the world, US, UK, Germany, etc.?
It's the question that we get asked a lot, because as everyone's looking, timing, efficiency, money, resourcing, it can work, but it depends how early you start your GVD, and I think it all goes back to relating to that question. I think that we quite often find that particularly some of the European requirements mean that you do have to go back and update some elements of the systematic reviews, and sometimes you can't use them where the standard of care maybe that has been used to populate, particularly if maybe it's been driven from a US perspective, that the timing might not work. It might be fine to be used for the AMCP dossiers and for submissions within that, but quite often the requirements in UK and Germany around timing, standard of care, what you use as your comparators, mean that there's so many things that have changed that you can't fully utilize it. There are always sections that you can pick and lift, if I can use a term like that. And I think that's what everybody's ambition is. We don't want to keep reinventing the wheels, but certainly, burden. Some countries now really want to see local burden data rather than maybe some of the global things. You would have to do a slightly sort of different type of targeted search. So I know that's probably not helpful, but it really depends. The ambition is to try and repurpose as much as we can, but bearing in mind country variability.
Thanks for laying that out. All right, let's go now. Ben, I'm going to direct this one to you. How do you work on parts of the SLR when you have a very geographically dispersed team? Are you sharing and allocating workload across that team? How are you managing the budget and the timeline with transparency to team members and to others? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all recognize how fluid timelines can be sometimes. Things moving around, moving milestones. It's very rarely they extend. It's more often they contract. So I think it's important because of the resource involved in some of these aspects. It's important that we've got to be able to manage it effectively, and efficiently. So I think one of the things that we use, and this is where Distiller certainly really helps, is that flexibility and transparency of stepping up the analyst review team, because we have the single project dashboard, so we can add analysts to the process, and as long as they've been trained on the protocol, etc., then they can pick that up, and we can sort of double up, I suppose, almost on the review process, and that helps sort of expedite throughout the different stages of the review. And I think with it being, I mean, the geographical locations didn't come up as a big issue on the first poll, I think, but it does really help with that, because you've got that single point of transparency of where the whole project's at and who's doing what and who's done how much, etc., and gives us a real sort of snapshot view of that, which is really helpful, especially when it comes to updating the clients in terms of status updates, so we can say exactly where things are up to. I think that's a really a big bonus, I think.
Gillian, I know that we've had this conversation with our whole panel about certainly the benefits of automation, but there's always the concern from our clients about the human touch. And using automation to address human error, but on the other hand, having enough interactivity with live humans to provide accuracy and quality and all of the things that are so ever so important. Talk to me about how you balance the use of automation to reduce human error, but where you also have human touch points.
Yeah, so I think we've probably covered this mostly, but similar really, and we've used the AI reprioritization, which, as Rachel was saying, is very low risk, to make sure that we're looking at the most relevant articles first. But one thing we still do to have the human touch is a pilot stage. So particularly if we're using a team of reviewers rather than the same 2 reviewers throughout, we would have a pilot stage where they're all reviewing the same articles and making sure they're aligned in their interpretation of the screening criteria, and regular touch points throughout. So we'll have a look at the decisions or any discrepancies in the decisions. We will quite often have a percentage checked by another person, or you could have an AI checker as well, like a quality control, just to make sure that the criteria are being interpreted in the same way, and then you can adjust as you go through and make sure that if something needs to change in the protocol, that we can document that and say, actually, the reviewers weren't making the same decision here. Let's update something. And Distiller is great for that, because it means that you can do bulk changes to things. That if you decide, actually, no, this population is relevant, or this treatment combination is relevant, as long as you've captured that somewhere as a label or as an answer to a question, you can go back and update everything. So I think there are definitely ways that it can help you to improve that consistency.
Thank you. Let's bring in a question from our audience, from Nicola. And Rachel, this is going to you. Is it easy to get extracted data from software such as Distiller SR into the GVD format? I.e., does the software make it easier than working in Excel?
Well, Excel is actually one of the outputs you can choose from the reporting menu in Datorama. And again, a lot of our teams are really comfortable in Excel. And so I feel like that's probably a format that a lot of them will revert back to when they're extracting the data from their literature review. There's a number of different formats. And yes, it can assist with the final document creation as far as having clean data easily accessible at your fingertips. As far as the GVD format, that still requires human effort. And again, every team will work differently, and their value story is going to look different. But as far as being able to extract the data, the relevant data from Distiller SR, absolutely.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Nicola, for that question. I know that most of us probably still use Excel in some manner. And I'm interested from our panel, at what point did you decide to transition from Excel or spreadsheets into a different way of doing this? Jillian?
I think it happened gradually for us, really. And there are some projects where we still use Excel, and others where we use Distiller SR. So I think it depends on the volume of literature and the complexity of the questions that you're trying to ask. So I think definitely the project I mentioned earlier, where we were cataloging and categorizing the evidence, we concluded from that there has to be a better way of doing this. There has to be a more efficient way of doing this. So I think that was the turning point when we started to look for other solutions.
So volume. Ben, any big trigger for you?
Yeah, I think we were having obviously doing a lot of work in this area in terms of literature reviews and recognizing some of the challenges that we face in terms of squeezing timelines and budgets, etc. We had our own internal objective to find, are we doing it the best way? So we ran some internal pilots just with a few projects and just to see how we could justify the investment, I suppose. And I think looking at it in terms of what the potential for saving was in terms of time and resources. And I think based on that, it was quite an easy decision to sort of make the switch, just because we couldn't carry on doing it the way that we were, because it's the pressures that everyone's under doesn't really allow for that. So and I think it's been a sort of a learning curve for the team, obviously, and I think the analysts who are doing the screening, etc., have adapted much quicker, perhaps than some of the more seasoned sort of systematic reviewers who are very wedded to their lovely homemade Excels with lots of nice dashboards and macros and things that
a lot of work on those.
They sort of built up over the years. But I think people recognise it. They can see, it's quite apparent what the benefits are, and I think it's as we've sort of rolled it out within the team, it's been picked up, and yeah, I think we're not having those issues anymore.
So wrap us up with how you approach this decision making from an executive level and thinking about it from a large department and organization perspective, the transition from maybe the Excel or spreadsheet way of doing things into a new Vista.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, because again, we had to put a business case together for the investment. So sort of in justifying that, I think from a group resourcing perspective, it really makes sense, because it means we can bring different people into the projects, and we train up quite a lot of people from different teams, so we can get the best people with the experience maybe in that scientific therapy area to come in and work on projects, so that not necessarily just systematic reviewers that we can bring in. I think that just really helps us getting the best people in to do that element of that piece of work. But it just works for us having not having Excel sheets on people's desktops that they can use, but maybe other people can't always decipher. So I just think from a scalability perspective, it's great for us. So
thank you.
We still review. We continue. It will continue to evolve, and our decision making will continue to require that we can justify the value.
Mm-hmm. Different use cases. Well, audience, I want to thank you for spending an hour with us. Don't go yet. I have something important to say before you disappear on us. But before I get to that, I want to thank each of our panelists. You really gave us some outstanding insights, some really pragmatic tips and tricks of the trade. Jillian, Ben, Sue, and Rachel, thank you for that overview of Distiller SR. So with that, I want to give a heartfelt thank you to everyone that has joined us today, and I hope you found it informative and that you have an absolutely wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Patty. In closing, we hope that you enjoyed this HealthEconomics.com webinar sponsored by Distiller SR, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.